I think we can all agree that in the current version of Baldur's Gate 3, Minthara is highly underserved by the narrative. And that's not for lack of effort. The devs actually wrote and cut at least one entire subplot from her story during development. It's just that a lot of their efforts were wasted. So it's no surprise that as far as video topics go, reimagining Minthara's companion story is by far the most popular request I've received. And since April is my channel's 1-year anniversary, I wanted to do something special to thank you all for watching these videos and subscribing and just generally hanging out with me. So here's what we're gonna do. Today, I will be taking you through Minthara's development history through early access, touching on the oddly soap opera-y plot they cut from her storyline, breaking down her character and story in the full release, and suggesting a bunch of changes to that story to make her a more robust addition to the companion roster. Cool? Okay, this video is going to contain a bunch of spoilers, scalding hot takes, some twists, and just a whole lot of ranting and raving, so let's get into it. Part 1. Minthara in Early Access. To get one thing out of the way right now, the earliest early access version of Minthara looked like a teenager, and it was extremely strange. Because she still possessed the cutting, mature tone of actress Emma Gregory, her youthful appearance was very jarring.
Tell me what you know. The Absolute will reward us with such power if we find this place.
As far as I can tell, this was never intended to be her final look. It was just a placeholder model, and the concept sketch in the game's official art book is much more reminiscent of what she would eventually become. But it's still so very odd. Otherwise, what we see from Early Access Minthara is basically what we got in the full release. She just has less content overall. We got noticeably less information on her indoctrination into the cult of the Absolute, as well as fewer insights into her emotions and inner world, courtesy of our shared tadpole-ish affliction. I think they eventually added those things because they wanted to humanize her a little bit in preparation for her recruitment as a companion. But of course, since the early access version of Baldur's Gate 3 only included Act 1, we were not able to recruit her on a good or bad playthrough. And there was a world in which we might have never been able to recruit her. There was actually a lot going on with Minthara behind the scenes outside of early access. According to an interview conducted by Nerds and Beyond with Emma Gregory, lead writer Adam Smith and the rest of the developers at Larian weren't entirely sure they were going to include Minthara as a companion. And it was only through the expansion of the character and the feedback from early access players that she was eventually cemented as part of the group. To some extent, this explains why Minthara has significantly less content than the majority of the rest of our companions. While Lae'zel, Astarion, and the rest were being developed as key group members from the start, Minthara's role was up in the air for quite a while. And that's not the only thing that developed outside of our narrow view of her in early access. The core of Minthara's character always seems to have been the same. She was always intended to be a ruthless but fiercely loyal warrior, raised in the upper echelons of Drow society to be cutthroat in both a political and literal sense. First using those skills in service of the Spider Queen goddess Lolth in the Underdark, Minthara would then be infected by a Mind Flayer tadpole and be used against her will as a member of the cult of the Absolute. She's hardened, strategically astute, and she's basically never known peace since the moment she was born.
And I survived my first assassination attempt while I still suckled at my mother's breast.
But those delightful hidden elements of Minthara's character, her humor and her vulnerability, those were discovered through years of collaboration between Gregory and Smith. Like the majority of the core cast of Baldur's Gate 3, Gregory was hired on in 2019, 4 whole years before the game would finally come out. As such, she had a lot of time to work with Smith on Minthara's character, and she helped push her to grow into the complex person we see in the full release. To quote Gregory, "I began to develop this wonderful relationship with Adam Smith, my writer, where I would decide to deliver a line that he'd written in a certain way, and that would then inspire him to push the character in a certain direction." And I think that quote's worth remarking on, because this is what you get when you let artists have fun and explore without rigid profit goals and quarterly deadlines.
Just give the word and I will kill the clown. We would be praised as heroes.
One thing that did change from early access was Minthara's sex scene. Once we got past that classic under construction stage, Minthara's scene was fleshed out. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I recall it being the first one available during early access. I think that Larian was trying to incentivize players to go through with the Grove Massacre, so it was like a horny little reward. But maybe I'm misremembering. I couldn't find any hard data to back up this claim. But if you think her sex scene is freaked out in the full release, you might be surprised to find out that it was freaked out in a different way before. In a different position, you might say. And in a version that didn't actually make it into early access, that sex scene would have resulted in more than just a cute little cuddle session. Trigger warning for pregnancy, because a combination of data mining, accidental leaks through official patches, and a single overlooked line in the Dark Urge storyline confirmed that at some point during development, Minthara was supposed to be pregnant. Part 2. Minthara was supposed to be pregnant. And I'm the dad! I need to take responsibility for my reckless actions! Okay, so the player character might not have been the potential child's other parent. It's kind of unclear, and it's more than likely that the plot was rewritten a few times before being scrapped. Some evidence seems to suggest that Minthara had a daughter, or perhaps she was pregnant and just assumed she was having a daughter.
Murdering Orin. Raising my daughter.
It would make sense for Minthara to just default to calling this baby a girl, by the way. Drow society is a matriarchy, and men are treated as little more than slaves.
In Menzoberranzan, after a house has 2 sons, every subsequent male-born child is slaughtered at birth, as it is useless, even for breeding. You have the aura of a 3rd child about you.
So a daughter would be highly preferable for political reasons. She'd be able to inherit Minthara's legacy. There are also voice lines from other characters that reference Minthara's pregnancy, and Karlach and Astarion seem to imply that the player is the responsible party.
Minthara's pregnant. A new life. A little one sprung from all this fucking chaos. All the more reason to put this place to rights. Give little Minthy every chance of a normal life. And hey, if you're in the market for godmothers, I have availability from now till the rest of my life.
So, Minthara has one in the, proverbial oven. I'm amazed you're still in one piece. I thought she'd bite your head off when she was done with you.
However, Astarion also has a different line that I assume would have served as a kind of contingency if the player didn't sleep with Minthara at all or didn't have the anatomy to cause a pregnancy.
I wonder if she bit the head off her mate after they'd done the deed.
Then there's the Dark Urge line, which doesn't directly state that Minthara is pregnant, but it does heavily insinuate it.
Of course, Master. We will always need to sire more Balspawn. It appears that may be already underway. The drow is a fecund choice of mate. Well done.
So it does appear that at some point the plan was for Minthara to be pregnant, and if you're wondering how that would have worked, and what purpose it would have served in the game's narrative, don't worry, I got you. I spent several days obsessing over this idea and trying to figure out what Larian was even trying to do with a possible Minthara pregnancy plot, and why they decided to scrap it. And so without further ado, let me bring back an old classic for this special 1-year anniversary video. It's so tall. You can't even see it. You can't even see it. It's so tall. Do I just do this? I could do this, yeah. The tinfoil hats have returned, and they're in party mode. So, okay, I'm going to break down my personal conspiracy theory on how the whole Minthara pregnancy plot was going to go down, but in order to do that, we kind of have to go through her entire in-game story. So, when you first meet Minthara in the full release of Baldur's Gate 3 at the Goblin Camp in the game's first act, you are forced to make a choice. Kill her, knock her unconscious so she reappears in the game's second act, or lead her and her goblin army to the Druid's Grove in the name of the Absolute and slaughter a bunch of innocents. If you side with Minthara and raid the Grove, you have the opportunity to take her to bed with you that night. Or take her to altar, I guess? After the two of you get freaky on a slab of stone in what is genuinely one of the most beautifully staged scenes in the game, you have the opportunity to learn quite a bit about Minthara, including how tormented she is by the difficult life she's been made to lead.
She flinches as layers of her psyche peel back, revealing the scars of a life spent anticipating a knife in the back. The memories of countless dead slain too soon. Not just enemies, but family, friends, lovers.
She's also pretty unsettled by the fact that her mind feels clear and she no longer hears the voice of the Absolute while in your presence. And this results in her calling you a heretic and trying to assassinate you in your sleep before relenting, accepting you as a true soul in the Absolute cult, and telling you to meet her at Moonrise in Act 2.
Travel to Moonrise. We will meet again there, at the heart of the Absolute's power.
Looping back to that pregnancy plot, assuming you then rescued her from Moonrise, where you find her begging for her life before Ketherick, she would later come to you in camp and tell you of her condition.
I'm a mommy.
Mommy?
I'm a mom.
Mamacita.
No, I'm a mommy.
A mom of what? A dog?
I have a daughter.
As we already discussed, not everyone who recruits Minthara would have gotten her pregnant. It just literally wouldn't be possible for some players. And Larian clearly planned for that, as evidenced by Astarion's 2 different voice lines. If you weren't the one to get Minthara pregnant, then I believe conception would have occurred off-screen just before the events of the game, and she would have no memory of how it happened, but she'd assume the Cult of the Absolute had a hand in it. Which, to be clear, is horrifying. She'd make it clear that she has not yet decided what she's going to do, but that she thought you should know, either because of your part in it or simply because you're traveling together and need to trust one another. The fate of this potential child is where things start to get a little bit messy, and why, I assume, Larian decided to cut this plot altogether. As we saw with how they handled Ascended Astarion, Larian doesn't have a particularly strong backbone when it comes to taking a stance on more nuanced social issues, and including a plot wherein a woman is impregnated, by the player or otherwise, while under the influence of a mind-controlling religious cult. That just feels like a pot of boiling water that Larian probably wasn't keen on jumping into. To put it mildly, that's a very complicated issue to raise that would bring up questions about consent, bodily autonomy, and abortion rights. So I do understand why Larian decided not to include this in the game, and why they also probably chose to include this line of dialogue in the full release.
When we lay together, I was myself, for the first time since they butchered my mind.
Though I don't really know if that wipes away the moral ambiguity of the situation. Whether her mind was hers in the moment or not, that connection was still precipitated via brainwashing, but whatever, I'm losing the plot. The point I'm trying to make is that I understand why Larian didn't end up including this in the game, but while I'm not usually a fan of pregnancy storylines in just about any kind of media, I can see some merit in this one if it were allowed to develop, to use topic-appropriate language. Though I personally wouldn't include the Minthara pregnancy plot in my reimagining, I do think that it had the opportunity to hit on some relevant ideas that are already present in her story. Namely, Minthara deciding for herself whether or not to carry the pregnancy to term could have been a great way for her to symbolically reclaim her life and body from her past. Not just as an unwilling member of the Absolute cult, but also as a facet of Drow society, where pregnancy and children are political and women have specific duties and expectations placed on them from the moment they're conceived. Whether or not she ultimately terminated the pregnancy or went ahead with having the baby, off-screen at the end of the game probably, the important part is that she would have been able to choose. But again, I'm personally pretty averse to pregnancy plotlines, and there are other ways to express this idea of freedom of choice in Minthara's story. Ways I've tried to weave into my broader reimagining of that story. So, let's proceed with Part 3. Reimagining Minthara's story. When we crash land on the beach in the full release of Baldur's Gate 3, one of the first faces we see is Minthara's, and she immediately tells you who she is by giving the flaming ship falling out of the sky like a meteor a serene, curious smile. When infiltrating the goblin camp, she's built up as the Drow, a war-minded military leader, here to whip the goblins into fighting shape and retrieve the mysterious weapon the Absolute has sent her there to find. The very first moment you meet her, she probes your mind through your shared telepathic connection, demands you aid her in her mission, and mentions torturing multiple people. One of those people is Halsin, and if you speak with him, he asks you to help him kill Minthara and the other leaders of the goblin camp. All of this is great. I would keep it all in my reimagining. It sets Minthara up as a formidable enemy, a villain worthy of dispatching or allying with if you're feeling evil. So why then would any good aligned player in their right mind decide to head over to their passive skill bar, toggle on non-lethal, and knock this woman unconscious? Why wouldn't they end her life then and there the way that they do with literally every other hostile NPC in the game? The answer is that there is no answer. There is no logical reason why a player would knock out this one random drow, but if they want to recruit Minthara without doing anything evil, this is the only way to do it. And this is my first point of contention with Minthara's story in the full release. What is this metagaming nonsense? Isn't this supposed to be an immersive RPG? Why is this one story path hidden behind a clunky workaround? This time we actually do have an answer, and that answer is because this whole element of the game was shoehorned in post-launch. When Baldur's Gate 3 first launched, knocking Minthara out to later recruit her in Act 2 was not an option. If you wanted her as a companion, you had to raid the Grove. It was only after quite a bit of fan outcry that Larian caved and decided to add in this solution in patch 5. So, just to recap, originally, Larian wasn't sure they wanted to make Minthara a companion at all. Then, when they committed to making her one, she was only meant to be recruitable if you went down an evil path. And then they changed that retroactively post-launch so you could recruit her no matter what. If you've ever wondered why her story feels weirdly empty on a good run, now you know why. There is a part of me that understands why they soft-locked her behind an evil route, and even agrees with them. Actions should have consequences. I feel like I'm always screaming that on this channel. If you raid the Grove, Karlach and Will leave the party, and you gain Minthara in Act 2. But if you save the Grove and mow down the goblins, you keep Will and Karlach, but lose Minthara. Actions, consequences. Cause, effect. Does that mean you technically lose out on content no matter what decision you make? Yes. And that's a good thing. It encourages a second, third, fourth, or 500th playthrough, and it makes your choices feel considerably more impactful. This whole knocking her out and finding her in Act 2 later thing is just such a cheap way of placating players who want to have their cake and eat it too. But the cake is poisoned. Minthara laced it herself.
None shall be spared tonight, not even you.
In my opinion, giving players this easy out is just cheating them of experiencing the full weight of their decisions. I hate it, it sucks, but is there a way to make it suck less? Yeah. In my reimagining, an additional interaction would have to be tacked on to the end of her fight. This would effectively be a replacement for the scene you'd otherwise get during the Goblin Party in an Evil playthrough, just without the sex. Upon beating Minthara and clicking on her body, a short cinematic would play where she would be laying there, gravely wounded, goading you into finishing the job. You'd bend down and take hold of her arm to still her, and then your minds would connect and the artifact would pulse with a sensation. Hesitancy. Minthara's mind would be laid bare for you, and you'd feel fear and doubt within her. You'd see the harsh realities of the life that she's lived.
In Menzabaranzan.
And you'd see something else, too. Potential. Minthara, for her part, would freak the hell out. She'd ask what just happened, and tell us that for a moment, when the two of you touched, the voice of the Absolute had gone quiet. You'd have a few options by way of an explanation, just as you do in the post-coital scene, and while she wouldn't accept your answer, Minthara would at least stop actively trying to kill you. This whole experience would have clearly left her shaken, and you could suggest that she go to your camp and take some time to think and rest, or you could take advantage of the opportunity and finish the job and stab her in the heart. This would have been a bit of additional effort, but it would have made a huge difference in terms of immersion, so we're adding it to my reimagining. If you offered for her to come to camp, she'd be visibly considering the idea before ultimately shaking it off. She'd call you a heretic, though there'd be very little conviction in her voice, and she'd make a speedy retreat, never to be seen again, until the night after the Tiefling party. Once you've bunked down for the night, Minthara would creep up to you just as she does after the Goblin party. So no matter how you decide to resolve the Grove plot in Act 1, this scene would play out as long as Minthara is still alive. She'd hover over you, knife in hand, intent on murdering you in your sleep, and then she'd reel back as though hit by a wave of psychic energy. Here she would tell you what she does in the full release.
As I took out my blade, her voice returned to me. And she told me what I must do to purge myself of doubt. She told me to decide your fate, to determine if you are worthy.
The way this is animated in the full release, it reads more like she only steps back because you woke up. And I'm not really sure if that was intentional or if they just didn't have time to polish the scene, but in my reimagining, I'd prefer it be more clear that she was, in fact, influenced by the Absolute to stay her hand in that moment. If you raided the Grove with her, she'd tell you,
"Travel to Moonrise. We will be together in the Absolute's presence. And she will make us her champions.
And she would demand, not ask, but demand to join your adventuring party so the two of you could journey to Moonrise together. She can help guide you through the shadow curse that surrounds the tower, and what's left of her goblin army after the battle will scout ahead for signs of trouble. And if you saved the grove, she would demand to join your party, but for a different reason. She'd tell you that while she does not know why you spared her life, she will return the favor and spare yours. At least until she's deemed you worthy or unworthy as her god has demanded of her. She would urge you to come with her to Moonrise where the Absolute's voice is loudest and her power the strongest, unaware that you're already headed in that direction, and she'd explain that she knows how to safely traverse the Shadow Curse. This way, even good aligned players would have a reason to keep her around, and perhaps other characters could even weigh in to reinforce the idea. Someone like Astarion or Shadowheart would probably pipe up to say that having a guide who's familiar with and devoted to the cult could prove useful. So Minthara would join the party, and this is obviously the first big departure from the full release version of her character. One of my biggest issues with Minthara's character is that it feels like all of her development happens instantaneously, and there's no sense of growth or progression. From the moment she joins our camp, her story becomes very action-oriented and surface level. She's freed from the cult, she wants to murder its leaders, she achieves her goal, the end. But this woman was wrenched away from her home in the Underdark,
In Menzoberranzan,
where she lived under a strict and murderous matriarchy that worshipped a tyrannical spider goddess. Then she was infected with a mind flayer tadpole, made to renounce her faith for a new, false god, forced to act against her will, and then tortured by the people she trusted before finally being rescued. Her mind should be broken and confused. She should be distrustful of any new information she receives, and struggle to disentangle herself from the messy spider's web of incongruous thoughts. Who is she really? What does she actually believe, and what was forcibly drilled into her by years of trauma or psychic indoctrination? That's an internal conflict that deserves significant time to let play out, and yet...
She knows it all in a moment. Her mind reels, but is no longer clouded. She accepts the truth. She has no choice.
I understand that while she's under the influence of the Absolute, she's literally not of her own mind. But we see during her romance scene that just because the Absolute's voice falls silent, that doesn't mean she suddenly stops believing in its godhood. Her deconstruction ought to happen over a longer period of time. What we get in the full release is rushed and messy, and it could have been helped significantly by allowing Minthara to accompany us through the remainder of Act 1. So, let's talk about Part 4. Reimagining Minthara in Act 1. In the full release, if you try to bring Minthara back to any of the Act 1 locations, she just straight up refuses, telling us that she won't leave the Shadow-Cursed lands until Ketheric is dead. But fun fact, there is a weird, buggy way to string her along. If you cast Silence on her, she travels with the group and you can take her to the Mountain Pass or the Underdark. As far as I know, she has absolutely no reaction to the Underdark, but for some reason she has some unvoiced dialogue barks at the Githcresh that are just duplicates of lines said by Tav or Dirge. And she used to have one unique line referencing Lae'zel's relationship with Vlaakith, which suggests that at some point during development, the team was considering letting Minthara double back at least to the Mountain Pass. And you better believe that in my reimagining, she'd be able to go there and the Underdark. But before we can really start to develop Minthara's reimagined story in Act 1, we have to address the druid in the room.
Daddy Halsin, they call me.
So when Larian first decided to allow players to recruit Minthara while still saving the Grove, there was this weird visual glitch where Minthara and Halsin would end up sharing a tent. Because again, the devs never planned for players to have both of them in camp at the same time. They patched it later, but I always found it odd that there wasn't more of a confrontation between the two of them. Not only were they mortal enemies, but Minthara pulls a power move on the druid and forcibly takes his camping spot. This simply cannot stand. Where is the drama? Well, believe it or not, there used to be drama. Data miners discovered a scene where Halsin presents the player with an ultimatum.
But either Minthara or I must leave. I shall honor your choice, whatever it may be.
Some people seem to think that this moment is out of character for Halsin, but I don't know. She literally tortured this man. I think that this is a fair response. If you've seen my Kaga video, then you already know that I don't think Halsin should have been a companion, but if he is here, then this scene should also be here. or at least a version of it. In my reimagining, it would trigger the following night after you've recruited Minthara, but you'd be able to talk Halsin down and appeal to his good nature by suggesting that perhaps Minthara could be rehabilitated. And obviously he has his own reasons to go to the Shadowcurse lands with you. Meanwhile, Minthara would insist that she doesn't actually care about Halsin at all. She was only using him to find the location of the grove, and now that she has a new directive from the Absolute,
I have no quarrel with you.
so we have a tentative truce, and we can move forward. In my reimagining, when Minthara joins your camp after the goblin or tiefling party, she would make it abundantly clear that she's still very much put off by the fact that when she's around you, the Absolute's voice falls silent. There wouldn't be any psychic link that instantly informs her of everything. She wouldn't gain immediate clarity. She would still be convinced of the Absolute's godhood. And the other characters, but especially Shadowheart, would remind you to keep any and all information about the Astral Prism from Minthara, since in her mind, the prism is just a weapon that the Absolute has sent her to find, and you don't want to risk her taking it before she's served her purpose and brought you to Moonrise. You could still try to prod Minthara by poking holes in her logic and encouraging her to think beyond blind faith, but these early attempts wouldn't do much. She'd basically just call you a heretic again and wonder aloud if the Absolute is using you to test her faith. She'd even try to convince you to see her side of things, reminding you that you are a true soul and your destiny is to serve the Absolute and rule over your underlings. She would also urge you to take the mountain pass to the Shadowcurse lands, and if you do, she would have a lot to say about the dealings of the Gith Kresh. Minthara would see a lot of value in the way that the Gith operate, and consider adapting some of their practices into her own faith, strengthening her fighting forces through combative trials for the glory of their goddess and all that. She would approve of the Gith's actions all the way up until they put a bounty on Lae'zel's head. Minthara would contextualize this as yet another foolish god like Lolth who performs terrible acts of cruelty on their most loyal and devout followers. She's come to respect Lae'zel as a fierce warrior and a woman of conviction, and Minthara would view the Gith who attempted to carry out Vlaakith's orders as betrayers and mindless drones, which the player might find very ironic, and they could tell her as much. But Minthara would be adamant that the Absolute and its followers are nothing like the other gods. They may be working towards a common goal, but they work together. There is no discord, no sudden twists of the knife, no poisoned goblets. And if the Gith, or perhaps her own people, could just be brought to the light, they'd understand that their worship is wasted on the likes of Lolth or Vlaakith. So it would sound like Minthara just hasn't learned anything here, but this would actually sow the seeds of doubt later on in Act 2 when Minthara finds herself in a similar situation with Ketheric and the Absolute. And if you decided to go to the Underdark, there would be even more opportunities for Minthara's development. In my reimagining, the second Minthara stepped foot in the Underdark, she would anxiously tell you she can't be there and that she needs to return to the surface at once. When you ask why, she would tell you that if she's spotted by any Lolth-sworn drow, she would be executed on sight for turning her back on the Spider Queen. She would be genuinely terrified to face her people again, and you'd have to pass a persuasion or intimidation check to get her to stay in the adventuring party and not just head back to camp for the whole thing. You would essentially have to assure her that as long as she's with you, she's under your protection, and that this is a necessary step in the direction of Moonrise. In the Underdark, she'd have plenty of offhand remarks to make about the various other species that live there, all of which she sees as lesser beings. Minthara's reluctance to be here would prompt further conversations with her in camp. This is where she would talk at length about her home in Menzoberranzan.
In Menzoberranzan,
aka the City of Spiders. And though she'd deliver her lines with that dry, deadpan charm, it would be clear that she does in fact harbor a lot of negative emotions toward how she grew up. In the full release, I believe that you get the most insight into this when you romance her, but I wish that she was more explicit about her feelings with non-romanced players as well. It's easy to get the wrong impression of Minthara if you're not romancing her and just assume she still abides completely by her cultural rules. But that's not the case. While she does have a great fondness for the city she grew up in, she recognizes that the paranoia and betrayal and violence she was subject to weren't normal. In the full release, it's kind of presented as though she's always known that these things weren't okay, and she's just had to put up with them. Or maybe it was part of that...
She accepts the truth. She has no choice.
But in my reimagining, I would prefer that these conversations play out basically like a slow realization. It's as though she's had her head down her whole life, just trying to survive day by day until she was infected and ripped away from everything she's ever known. And now she's coming to understand some of the wrongs that have been done to her, and some of the wrongs that she's done in turn. And she'd reflect on these things with the player. I am not at all suggesting that she would suddenly become a sweet, warm presence. God, no. There's still some elements of her drow upbringing that she clings to, and Minthara wouldn't be Minthara if she wasn't kind of a devious villain. At this point, she'd still pin much of the blame on Lolth and be committed to the way of life dictated to her by the Absolute. But progress is progress, no matter how incremental. The last and most important bit of Minthara's story in the Underdark would have to do with Nier. Canonically, these two know and dislike each other, and it's not hard to see why. Though they technically fight on the same side, they're effectively rivals, since they're both looking to gain the favor of the Absolute and become more powerful in the cult. Add to that the fact that Nier is a male drow, and so Minthara feels she's inherently better than him, and we've got ourselves a smoke powder keg of interpersonal volatility. If you had Minthara in your party when you freed Nier, the two of them would kind of snipe at each other, and if you decided to side with him, then you would just go on your way without incident. But if you decide to take Nier's head, as asked of you by Sovereign Spa, Minthara would have a bit of a crisis of faith. Minthara hated Nier on a personal and a professional level. Minthara is a professional hater. That tracks. As a female drow, and just as a person, she found him distasteful, and she's glad he's dead. But as a follower of the Absolute, things get more complicated. He's one of her gods chosen. For whatever reason, the Absolute selected him to be a true soul, to be her equal. But now he's gone, and Minthara had a hand in his undoing. She'd be fighting between her two identities as a drow and an Absolute cult member. Are the drow wrong? Are men equal to women? Is the Absolute wrong? Nier was dispatched easily. What was so special about him to be a true soul? And the player could suggest that maybe they're both wrong. Or at least the Absolute is. I can see where if you were playing a female drow, you might be like, nah girl, men are trash. But either way, this would be just another hole poked in the shroud that's been cast over Minthara's worldview. Another set of questions that she has to contend with. And that leads us very nicely into Part 5. Reimagining Minthara in Act 2. I'd love to just skip ahead to Moonrise, but before we can convene at the tower, there's one Act 2 character that I feel we have to touch on who's tangentially related to Minthara's story. And that's Karnus.
Yes. They'll do nicely.
I love Karnus. He's one of the most unsettling things in the game, and if I could pull him around on a little leash for the whole adventure, I absolutely would. We unfortunately don't get to learn a whole lot about Karnus in the events of Baldur's Gate 3, but we do know that he's a Drider, which means that he was once a drow who was punished by Lolth and was made to undergo a horrific transformation into this spidery centaur-like being. After either being cast out by Lolth herself or through some machinations of the cult, Karnus came into the service of the Absolute, and more specifically, the service of Minthara. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if most people don't know this or just forgot about it because there's only like one line that addresses it, and you only actually hear it if you side with Minthara and slaughter the Grove, but Karnus answers directly to Minthara.
A wretched creature in my service can guide you through the curse.
I think that's really interesting considering Minthara herself was once sworn to Lolth, and now she apparently has command over this creature made in her god queen's hideous image. I really wish that we knew just a little bit more about this dynamic and perhaps intensified it, as I think it has the opportunity to deepen both characters. Obviously, Karnus isn't exactly up for extended, coherent conversation, but it would be cool if he offhandedly mentioned Minthara if you met him without having her in the party. If you first see him during the Harper's ambush, maybe he could call out and ask if the movement in the dark is his mistress Minthara, since he'd presumably have just seen her on her way to Moonrise. Or, if you summoned him with the Spider's Lyre, he could wonder how you came into possession of the instrument, and ask if it was given to you by his mistress. Maybe he could even have something to say about how he admires her because she had the good sense to worship the Absolute and betray the spider bitch. Which is what he calls Lolth, by the way. I'm not just spinning that insult out of whole cloth.
The Queen? They still follow the spider bitch?
Then once you speak with Minthara again, you could talk with her a little more about Karnas. She could reiterate the dialogue you get with her post-Goblin party and extrapolate on it a little bit. And if you met him while she was in your party, he would venerate her. Coming across Karnas when you're with the Harpers would prompt him to ask Minthara why she's standing among enemy agents, and if you summoned him with the Lyre, he'd give off similar energy to a dog who's really happy to see you when you get home from work. A very sick, extremely creepy dog. I love Karnas so much, he's so cute. If you decided to kill him, Minthara would disapprove, but she wouldn't be too broken up about it. I imagine that once Minthara is free from the Absolute's control, she would see a lot of her former self in Karnas, and perhaps even pity him in her own pragmatic way. He would represent a future that she narrowly avoided via multiple avenues. First, by escaping the Spider Queen's wrath, and then by wresting control of her mind from the Absolute. And it would be cool to hear her ruminate on that a little. But here, before she's met with Ketheric or had any real epiphany, she'd just be moderately annoyed that she lost a servant. He was too unstable to be of any real use long term, so we just kind of expedited the inevitable. We don't get a lot of information on Lolth as a deity in Baldur's Gate 3, and this could have been a great way to drop a little lore on us. And this is nitpicky, but I would have liked a little bit more of an explanation for how and why Karnas is specifically bound to Minthara. Like, does some part of his fractured mind still recognize female drow as authority figures, so she was the only one that could bring him to heal? That would be pretty cool. Just 1 or 2 extra lines of dialogue would do. I'm just curious. Of course, you can also choose to keep Karnas alive and journey with him to Moonrise, where he skitters up the tower like a nightmare creature. Upon arriving, Minthara would be elated. Finally, she's made it back to the seat of the Absolute's power. She will report to Ketheric and receive fresh orders, and you, the player, will be judged before her god. The way I'm imagining it, if you recruited Minthara, then you literally wouldn't be able to get into Ketheric's throne room without her in your party. The doors would be locked, and the guards would tell you that the general isn't seeing anyone because he's dealing with the fallout of some business that happened in the wilderness, something about a druid's grove and a lost weapon. When you get to camp, Minthara would have an exclamation mark above her head. You'd brief her on the situation, and she'd urge you to take her with you to Moonrise. They know her face, and that she was directly involved with the plot on the grove, so they'd open the doors, and we would finally get the scene. Ketheric's Moonrise scene would remain almost exactly the same in my reimagining as it is in the full release because I'm in love with it. While I talk about it a bit in my Ketheric video, I obviously focus more on his presence, but Minthara is also great in this scene. Emma Gregory really captures the rage and despair and confusion that Minthara must be feeling in this moment, when she's returned to her leader hoping for grace and instead getting nothing but cruelty for her failure to complete the mission and find the weapon.
No!
Obviously, since Minthara is in our party during this scene instead of already in the room, things would have to change slightly. She'd step forward and greet Ketheric with the honor and respect of a soldier returning to their superior. She'd start to explain what happened back in Act 1 and immediately be cut off by Ketheric raising his hand. In that low, dangerous tone, he would ask Minthara why she had returned without the weapon in hand. Minthara would try to stutter out an answer, but Zarel would cut her off, telling Ketheric that it's clear Minthara had failed to live up to their expectations and doesn't deserve to command an army. And then the scene would play out exactly as it does in the full release.
I will not be slandered! General, you saw my reports. You know it's not my fault.
Take her below.
No! Please! Mercy! Please!
This is such an important scene for our understanding, not just of Minthara's character, but of the operations of the Cult of the Absolute. But I'm of the opinion that this only really packs its full emotional punch if you raid the Grove, which might have been another reason why Larian originally only let you recruit Minthara if you sided with her in Act 1. Raiding the Grove feels awful, right? Betraying these people who have come to trust you makes you feel like a monster, and the fact that a bunch of them don't even put up a fight makes things all the more tragic and terrible. It's a bloodbath. It was an atrocious thing to do, but you did it all the same because you were ordered to. And Minthara did it because her god ordered her to. After the raid, she confidently tells us that when we arrive at Moonrise, we will be named Champions of the Absolute. We will be glorified, exalted. And then we get there, and Minthara is in the middle of begging for her life. After everything she did, after all the blood she spilled, her god has betrayed her. The man she looked up to had ordered her to a slow and painful death. Her faith has been shattered. And you, an active participant in this heinous massacre, must also come to terms with this. You and Minthara are not champions. You're not valued. You are expendable cogs in a machine that expects you to do the unthinkable and be grateful for the opportunity. This point is made so much clearer if you raid the Grove. Doing a terrible thing on the order of your superior and being rewarded for it with your death is way more of an emotional gut punch than failing to carry out your orders and being punished for it. Thus, raiding the Grove works way better for Minthara's arc. But it still does work if you save the Grove. The lesson is just not as effective. And that lesson is that this level of unattainable perfectionism and authoritarianism chews people up and spits them out. It breaks their minds, bodies, and spirits, and then it subjugates the shattered pieces through fear. Which is ultimately the cult's undoing. Ruling through fear only works as long as the people are afraid, and sometimes all it takes is a small act of bravery to spark an uprising. In this case, that small act of bravery is rescuing Minthara from Moonrise. Just as she is in the full release, Minthara would be taken below to be tortured in my reimagining, and when you go down to visit the tastefully decorated torture chamber, all the options from the full release would still be there. If you're a monster, you could break her mind.
For the absolute.
For the absolute.
Or you could pull her out of her brain fog and whisk her away from Moonrise, and provide her safe refuge back at camp. This is where she'd really start to unravel. Minthara would be a tempest of anger. In a fit of righteous contempt, she would curse the gods and swear vengeance on Ketheric and the whole of the cult for casting her out like refuse. At her core, Minthara yearns for safety, acceptance, and loyalty, because those are really the only privileges she's ever been denied. But she goes about searching for them in the worst way imaginable. All she cares about now is gaining power to become stronger to exact her revenge so that she might never be betrayed again. Which means that your objectives align no matter how you decide to play her character moving forward. And that's actually something that I love about Minthara in the full release. Though Minthara is an unambiguously evil person who's totally cool with slavery and torture, and she lives her life despite her enemies, she wants to take down the cult, and so does the player. Whether the player agrees with Minthara that the power of the Absolute should be harnessed, or whether they believe it should be destroyed, doesn't really matter. At least for now, Minthara and the player's goals are the same, and Minthara understands this because she's very practical. Even her cruelty has a twisted purpose. She abhors what she considers senseless bloodshed, and even reprimands the player for going along with her raid on the Grove.
Those who kill without motive cannot be trusted. I would not like to wake with your knife at my throat and never understand the reason why.
There are actually kind of a lot of opportunities for Minthara to express disapproval or dissent for actions the player takes in both a good and evil direction, which is somewhat of a rarity. Most characters follow pretty clear moral guidelines, but not Minthara. Her worldview is more complex and arguably more mature than the rest of the companions. Plus, it's just kind of fun to have a little healthy debate in camp. But whether you agree with her stances or not, the fact remains that you're stronger together, and you're going to take Ketheric down side by side. As you venture through Act 2, Minthara would slowly recover memories of her indoctrination, due to her undergoing the trauma of psychic torture and being broken out of it by the player. She would tell us the story of being wined and dined by Ketheric, as she does in the full release, but she would stop short of mentioning Orin.
Ketheric proposed an alliance between Moonrise and Mensa Baranzan. He invited me to the head of his table, as his guest of honor. I was wary, of course. If I had been in his position, the food would have been poisoned. It was not the food I should have been wary of. Ketheric nodded his permission, and I was taken below.
It would be clear that while she once revered this man, she now sees him as nothing more than a target. But a target that should not be underestimated. While she's faced blades at her back and outright assaults on her home in Mensa Baranzan, going against a respected immortal military leader is a task even she has never attempted, which would make your shared victory over him all the sweeter. But with every battle won, the war wages on for Minthara. Seeing Orin again and witnessing the truth of the Absolute would only strengthen her resolve and further her ambitions. She'd sit on Ketheric's throne like a badass, just as she does in the full release.
I will never tire of sitting on dead men's thrones.
And then she would tell you that she's finally remembered that it was Orin who originally infected her with the Mind Flayer tadpole. Crucially, she'd skip over the traumatic details, but be noticeably affected by them. And she'd tell the player Orin must die for what she did. Which takes us to Part 6. Reimagining Minthara in Act 3. In the full release, Minthara starts Act 3 off pretty strong by offering to get rid of a child for you and then suggesting that refugees should be used for slave labor, all before you've explored a square foot of Rivington.
I don't know where to go.
The child ignores you. Would you like me to dispose of her?
She's so freaking horrible and hilarious. But despite her having a pretty surprising amount of reactivity around the city, most of it isn't particularly meaningful. The first time I brought Minthara to Act 3, I was astounded by how little she seems to care about things she should absolutely care about. For instance, I'm a little bit disappointed that Minthara doesn't have more to say about the Drow twins at Sharesa's caress. If you're romancing her, she'll refuse to take advantage of their services in the most Minthara way possible.
I don't like to share. Lay a finger on them, and I'll cut you.
But I think this could go deeper than a silly joke about Minthara being possessive. We're standing in front of two drow who fled the Underdark of their own volition because they were displeased with the gender politics of their society. Like Minthara, they are outcasts who have forsaken their spider goddess, and so while they may not agree on the details, they do share a belief that drow culture needs to change. Meeting the twins should spark an idea in Minthara, that there are other drow out there who would jump at the chance for change, and perhaps it's time for a rebellious uprising against Lolth. The player could suggest that maybe Minthara should be the one to lead that rebellion, and she would respond by saying she has much grander ambitions. But this is just another seed sown. I'm doing a lot of that in this video. Keep it in mind. Another bit of reactivity I'd like to see in my reimagining has to do with Orin. The first time Orin reveals herself to you in Rivington, Minthara does have dialogue, but it doesn't sound urgent, and she doesn't react in the moment, only after the scene, and only if you decide to click on her.
While she lives, Orin will continue to terrorize us, and soon she will make good on her threats. She thinks we are weak, afraid, vulnerable. We need to prove her wrong.
I really wish that, if Minthara were in your party when you encountered Orin in Rivington, she had more to say during the scenes. I believe Orin can show up a total of 3 separate times, so for each one Minthara is present for, she would have one line that escalates in intensity. First yelling Orin's name out of shock, then demanding she stand and fight, then threatening to find and kill her in some morbidly creative way. And each time Orin would taunt her before disappearing, calling her a disappointingly soft flesh bag, or whatever unhinged insult Orin would throw out there. It may seem like a little thing, but honestly, I don't think there's enough done in the full release to really hammer home how fixated Minthara is on taking Orin down. And Orin seems to not even know that Minthara exists, which makes it so much weirder. The way Minthara tells it, Orin hand-selected her for true soulification. She saw something in her. There's the potential for a really interesting connection there, and I don't understand why they don't mine that for narrative gold. This is a huge part of Minthara's arc in the 3rd act. She has a personal vendetta against this woman. Why isn't there more content around it? The reason, of course, is time. In an interview with IGN back in 2023, Adam Smith admitted that if he were theoretically given unlimited time and resources to change Minthara's character, he would have added more interactions with Orin. So me and Smith agree. Though he says he only wants a couple more lines of dialogue, and I'm gonna be a little more greedy than that. Because outside of these little standoffs in Rivington, there are a couple more places that I wish Minthara had some more unique dialogue surrounding Orin. The first is when you discover Orin's been impersonating someone from camp and is holding them hostage in the Temple of Baal. While Minthara's done a pretty good job of staying stoic and strong and violently ravenous this whole time, this is where she would finally break down and admit to being petrified.
If you sense my fear, be sure that she does too. It is her greatest weapon.
That's kind of already in the full release, but I wish that this moment were just a little more vulnerable, and it should always happen in camp. In the full release, you can run across Orin under Elf Song, and I'd remove that bit entirely. It's not nearly as cinematic as the scenes that play out in camp. In my reimagining, when Orin shows herself, Minthara would be wide-eyed and paralyzed with fear, and when Orin disappeared, Minthara would begin by insisting everyone sleep in shifts to keep watch in case she returned. She'd start to sound progressively more panicked as she spoke. She'd remind the player that absolutely everyone is under suspicion, and that they shouldn't turn their back on a single party member, not even her, and that she won't hesitate to draw a blade if anyone so much as makes an out-of-character joke. By the end of her spiel, she would be frantic and out of breath, and the player would have to gently talk her down. Minthara would seem embarrassed, and she'd even apologize for the outburst before recovering enough to say that she's had enough of Orin's games. It's time for Orin the Red to be Orin the Dead. I am so sorry. And if you took Minthara with you for the confrontation, she and Orin would have one final exchange. In the middle of waxing poetic about blood and gore, Orin would take a break to torment Minthara, poking fun at the spoiled little drow who left a home that hates her only to be rejected by another god. She'd tell Minthara she had such high hopes for her, and she failed at every turn, and that she should run back to Menzoberranzan so that Minthara's own dear mother might have the pleasure of slicing her worthless carcass into pieces before Orin does it herself. And Minthara, while trembling, would tell Orin that no one, not even the murder god's chosen, will ever be able to tell her what to do or threaten her life again. And yes, this would also have to be worked into the Dirge-specific cutscene with Orin. Minthara's relationship with Dirge is honestly so interesting. I have a lot of thoughts about Dirge. We're not getting into them today. This video's already too long. Upon beating Orin, the same dialogue with Minthara from the full release would play out. She'd be in disbelief that Orin is finally dead. She's taken revenge, and yet...
One part of it. A smaller part than I had hoped.
It would seem that this was a hollow victory. Revenge did not heal her wounds, and a hunger for power can never really be satiated. All this triumph has given her is a new target. The brain. Minthara would once again try to convince the player to harness its power. Together, they could rule the world. Absolute power shared as equals. Or maybe as lovers? Part 7. Minthara's romance. Before we get to the end of Minthara's reimagined story, we have to talk about her romance arc. In the full release of the game, romancing Minthara is incredibly intense. It's instant and all-consuming. And none of that is a bad thing. It totally makes sense for Minthara's character. The first time Minthara has sex with you, instead of making this woman see God, you literally silence her God. And then you save her from certain death and shelter her from harm for the rest of the game. You leave quite an impression on her, and she lives her life in extremes. So I have no problem with her ramping up the relationship as quickly as she does. What I do have a problem with is that for a very intense romance, there's very little content, especially for players who are adhering to your typical good playthrough. And we already know why that is. It's because Larian didn't plan for her to be recruitable during a good playthrough. But she is, so she needs more content. One small change that would make a big difference is a couple of extra dialogue lines depending on the race and gender of your character. Like if you're playing a male drow, or really anyone other than another female drow, Minthara would have to acknowledge that she never thought that she'd see someone like you as an equal partner. And yet you've proven yourself to be strong and capable. Like so much of what she used to believe, this bias also proved to be incorrect. But the bigger and more obvious addition to my reimagining would be a second romance scene. Since most players won't even have seen the first one, having a one-on-one interaction with her in Act 3 is kind of necessary. And actually, this shouldn't be exclusive to just romancing her. This scene should take place no matter what, and it would take a romantic turn depending on your choices. In my reimagining, the scene would occur the night after you discover that Orin has kidnapped one of your party members. She would be standing at a vantage point in camp, clearly on high alert, and when you approached her, she'd tell you that she's volunteered to take the first vigil to keep watch. She'd throw out an insult about how she can't trust Will or Gale to have a sharp enough eye or mind for the job, but it would be obvious that the real reason she's up is that she's just too afraid to sleep. Here she would finally admit the full story of exactly what Orin did to her, laying out the details of her experience the way she currently does after killing Ketherick in the full release.
You've seen the horrors of the colony. Orin kept me there for days. She forced me to watch as my men were processed. Some for food, others as thralls. And then she placed the tadpole in my eye herself.
And after that, she would ask the player to promise her that they would keep her safe.
She had me in her clutches once before. Promise that you won't let it happen again.
Minthara and the player would realize that in her quest to gain power for acceptance, safety, and loyalty, she's already found it here, in this camp. But tragically, it's not enough. Orin still needs to die, and the player could remind Minthara that she proudly stands against Lolth and the Absolute, and together they've dispatched an avatar of Merkel. So what's one more godlike kill to hang on the trophy wall? With quiet earnestness, Minthara would thank the player for everything they've done for her, and remark on how her trust is not easily won, but that she cannot imagine a more worthy recipient. She'd muse on the future, what might be possible if you continued to combine your forces, and she would of course have her sights set on world domination. The player could lean into that fantasy or push away from it, perhaps suggesting Minthara return to the Underdark to demonstrate to Lolth and her followers that they hold no power over her anymore. She'd be receptive to this, but not long term, basically equating it to a vacation before the real work begins. As with her interaction with the Drow twins at Sharess's caress, Minthara would make it clear that she has more ambitious goals, ones that encompass not just the Underdark or the surface, but every plane of existence. She will conquer the world, but tonight she has a different type of conquest in mind. She'd proposition the player, and if they consented, they would go to bed together. If not, they'd go their separate ways amicably with the promise that come morning, Orin would bleed as red as the dawn. We've already covered what would happen when you kill Orin, so that means that we can skip right ahead to Part 8. The End. You've delivered the final blow to the Netherbrain. You're at the edge of the precipice, deciding the literal fate of the world, and Minthara is standing beside you, encouraging you to take control and become absolute. If you do, the same scenes from the Absolute or Dirge endings would play out, exactly as they do in the full release. These scenes are great, and they're extra great if you've romanced Minthara, because she really revels in the villainy of it all. I'm genuinely so glad that Larian added those in post-launch. Great job, team, no notes, 10 out of 10. If you decided to destroy the brain, however, Minthara would reflexively reach out and try to stop you, but there's no time. The brain falls out of the sky, and you and the party are thrown into the waters of the Chianthar. When you reach the docks, most of the companions would be relieved, but Minthara would be distraught. With voice and arms raised, she'd ask you why you didn't seize control when you had the chance, why you ripped power away from the both of you when it was finally within reach. No matter what answer you gave, Minthara would not be satisfied. You've broken her trust and her heart, and she'd exit the scene there so it could proceed as normal. I find this inclusion important because, as it stands in the full release, Minthara has very little reaction to you destroying the brain, which is extremely out of character. She spent the whole game talking about power and revenge, and she mentions multiple times that she believes the only path forward is via taking control of the brain. But if you ignore her and go through with the good ending, she's just like, "Oh shucks, that stinks. Guess I'll go and be evil somewhere else."
I shall not dwell on the past, though. The future is unwritten and rich with possibilities.
It doesn't make sense to me, but I think that adding my proposed reaction at the docks would give Minthara a little more agency at the end of her story. This also means if you romanced Minthara and destroyed the brain, you would not get a pre-party scene with the two of you in bed together the way you currently do in the full release. Not following through with her plans for a new world order would definitely be grounds for a breakup, but she would show up as a reluctant guest during the epilogue party. Whether you romanced her or not, she would greet you coldly and admonish your heroic behavior. And if you asked her why she's decided to come to the party, even if she hates you this much, she'd say that if there's one thing she'd learned from all those years in Drow high society, it's that social functions are a great way to gather intel on your allies and enemies. You could ask her which one you are, an ally or an enemy, and she'd wryly joke that she hasn't decided yet, but that she's brought enough poison to lace every wine bottle on the table if she comes to the conclusion that you're all more trouble than you're worth.
In truth, I have never enjoyed parties, although they do present the perfect opportunity for a poisoning.
She would also tell you that without the power of the Absolute, she's had to scrounge and scrape for scraps of influence wherever she can find them. And she'd admit that your adventure together inspired her to return to the Underdark and spark a rebellion against Lolth. This is already one of her endings in the full release, but in my opinion, it kind of comes out of nowhere. I'm hoping that through my reimagining, with all the hints at the Gith crush throughout the Underdark, with the Drow twins, and at the end of that added romance scene, it would hopefully feel a little more like a natural development for her character. If you romanced her, she'd have an extra line or two about how, despite it all, she still feels an emptiness without you by her side. And you could suggest that you try to mend your relationship, but she would deny you. After what you did, she can never trust you again. She might not trust anyone ever again. Let me be clear that this is, emphatically, still an evil ending. Minthara may be rebelling against Lolth and fundamentally changing the politics of the Underdark, but her ultimate goal is still selfish acquisition of power. I am not interested in giving Minthara a proper redemption arc. Is that satisfying if you're going for a fairy tale style happily ever after type of ending? No, and that's exactly the point. Removing someone from a bad situation isn't always enough to change their behavior. And just because someone's able to move away from one problematic idea does not mean they're suddenly flawlessly good and virtuous. Not everyone can be fixed, especially if they don't want to be. Minthara teaches us this lesson, and it's an important one. And, okay. This is usually the part of the video where I would start to wrap up and thank you all for watching, but Part 9. I've been lying to you all. I don't actually think that Minthara should have been a companion in Baldur's Gate 3. Like at all. Look, I gave you what you wanted for my channel anniversary, but this is still my party, and I'm gonna go off on a rant tangent if I want to. It's my party, I'll digress if I want to. I hold firm that, much like with Halsin, the time spent implementing Minthara as a full-fledged companion was misallocated, and Larian could have instead used that time to polish other aspects of the game. I even suggested at the end of my video on Ketheric that we should have swapped Minthara for him, and I stand by that. Don't get me wrong, I do adore Minthara, and I just spent Lolth knows how long arguing on how to better include her. But if you've seen any of my videos before, you know that I do try to keep these reimaginings at least somewhat realistic. And it was partially that self-imposed limitation that first cemented my opinion that she shouldn't be a companion. Because Minthara is so lacking in content, the amount of work required to really fix her just doesn't seem feasible. But it's not just an issue of time and resources. I think one of the reasons Larian was hesitant to include Minthara as a companion in the first place was that having someone who's brainwashed by the Absolute in your party kind of muddies the waters on why you can't just de-brainwash everyone you meet. Minthara tells us that when she's with us, she feels like herself, which means that conceivably, you could have repeated the same process with Dror Ragzlin, or Priestess Gut, or Zarel, or any number of brainwashed individuals. And you just don't. I also think that for the most part, the themes of Minthara's story are already pretty well covered by our other companions. Bodily autonomy, deconstructing from religion, power, fear, and a feeling of isolation from your peers are all very present in basically every story in this game. Even Astarion already hints at the idea that not everybody can be redeemed. And the other unique aspect of Minthara's character, demonstrating the unattainable perfectionism of the cult, could have easily been fulfilled without making her a companion, or elaborated on by other characters. Let me explain. When you meet Minthara at the Goblin Camp, everything would be as it is in the full release. If you choose to fight her, that scene I suggested in my reimagining would play out, except your minds would connect on their own. You wouldn't get any sense of emotion from the prism, and Minthara wouldn't say anything about no longer hearing the Absolute's voice. You'd just connect to Minthara's fear and vulnerability, but also her hatred and bigotry, and you could choose to take pity on her and let her escape, and she would run right to Moonrise. If you chose to raid the Grove, you could go through with that sex scene and learn the same information from your shared connection, but once again, Minthara would not stop hearing the Absolute's voice. You just connect with her the same way you do with any other tadpoled individual. Believe me, I am very aware of how gross and evil that is, but this is the evil path. And it's not even the only time that you can dub-con somebody into having sex with you in this game. In this version, she wouldn't show back up to try to kill you since she has no reason to. She'd just give you the Spider's Lyre and tell you to meet her at Moonrise to be named a champion of the Absolute. When you get to Moonrise, the scene would play out exactly as it does in the full release, and you would be able to go downstairs to witness Minthara being tortured, but you would not be able to save her. She'd be too far gone, and she'd become a mindless husk whose only role would be as another body in the line of fire when you lay siege to Moonrise later in Act 2. Is that tragic and terrible and pessimistic? Absolutely, but it's also the reality of what happens when you ally yourself with fascist regimes. Brainwashed or not, this is a cautionary tale. Minthara may not have been completely satisfied with the life she lived in Menzoberranzan, but she took advantage of the privileges it afforded her anyway, and she continued to proliferate the subjugation of others because it benefited her. And that life of violence and discrimination eventually led her to the Absolute, where she was destroyed. But that's just my opinion, and I recognize that it's not exactly a popular one, which is why I made this ridiculously long video that counters my own thoughts and feelings on the matter. And you watched it! Thanks for doing that. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and if you didn't, I don't know, leave me a hate comment or something. I don't mind chatting with people who hate me and my ideas and everything I stand for, as long as they're at least a little respectful. Okay, bye. Thanks for watching, bye. So, 1 full year on this channel. I don't even have the words to express how bizarre it is that I've been making videos on this channel for 1 entire year, and that people are actually watching them. I started this channel on a whim with my Will video, because everyone in my life was really tired of me ranting about him, so I decided to just throw my thoughts up on the internet, and to my continued surprise, people actually gave a shit about what I had to say. I don't know if that's ever gonna stop being weird, and I'm always just gonna be like pinching myself to make sure I'm not in some strange hallucination brought on by pain meds or something, but whether you've been here the whole time, or just a few months, or this is your first ever video of mine, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for deciding to spend your valuable time listening to my mad ravings. The stories have always been the thing that I retreat into when I'm having a rough time, and sharing them has been very freeing, but it's also very vulnerable. Getting to be creative and experience the creativity of others and just chat about ideas and video games and art, it keeps me going. And honestly, I don't think that I would have put out my comic if it weren't for the kindness and support that I've received from all of you in the last 12 months. And by the way, I still don't have an update for issue 2. The script is written, it's up to my artist, and I'm not gonna push them. They've got stuff going on, so. I've made like actual friends doing this, and just seeing familiar faces in the comments is really encouraging, and it brightens my day, so hopefully I can provide even a sliver of that kind of positive energy for you. As far as next month goes, I really don't know what I'm going to be doing. I have a couple of ideas. Maybe I'm going to do like a community poll or something, so look out for that in the next week or 2. Okay, this video is way too long and I'm losing my voice, so I should go before I just start thanking you over and over and over again. Be good to yourselves. Bye. Okay. How do I take this off without ruining my hair and makeup? Yeah! Ooh. Okay. Well, it's mostly intact. Ugh. Removing your conspiracy hats. I'm sorry to have brought you into this. This wasn't your idea. Data mine is waiting for sirens, waiting for sirens, waiting for sirens, come back to me, light, thank you. We don't get a whole lot of information on Lolth as a deity in Baldur's Gate 3, in Baldur's Gate 3. Lolth as a deity in Baldur's Gate 3. Let's try that again. I really wish that if you encountered Orin in Rivington while Minthara were in your party, she'd have more say to boop 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 boo. One more try.